This DVD continues from Volume 1. If you haven't watched the previous volume, it's highly recommended that you do so first. Just as spatial continuity was about taking separate shots and creating the illusion of continuous and unbroken space, temporal continuity is about creating the illusion of continuous and unbroken time. Much of this happens in editing, but blocking and editing are so interwoven that one really can't function without the other. So let's look at the essentials of editing. Editing is really a harsh thing to do because nothing in our world resembles the surprise of suddenly being somewhere else, so we usually want to bring as little attention to it as possible. The edits that flow best are the ones where we have something to follow across the edit because our attention is on that instead of the edit. As the man sits down, we're following his motion and we ignore the edit. Cutting in the middle of an action is a classic way to bridge cuts, and it works with both small and large movement. We might sometimes even create arbitrary action to bridge two cameras that would otherwise be a hard cut. As soon as a character is in motion, editing becomes less visible. Here we cut wide as soon as he starts walking. At the end of the walk, we'll cut close just before he stops. But in static dialogue, we don't automatically have something to follow across the edit, and this can easily get choppy if we cut at random. Here we're cutting between the characters without any particular care, and every cut is a surprise. But if we guide the editing by our curiosity and desire to see a character's reaction, we're following the interaction and we're likely to ignore the edits. Cutting based on curiosity is very effective because as we become interested in the other character, our thoughts shift, which mentally is already an edit. This mental editing in the viewer's mind is best illustrated with a situation where the man is saying something of great importance to the woman, but we hold back on the cut to her. As he keeps talking, we're now much more interested in her, and we actually want the edit. Editing when our curiosity shifts creates very seamless edits because we already think that way. Cutting before or after the natural edit point creates the feeling that we're either ahead of or behind the action. As the man walks to the table, we cut ahead, and he catches up, which creates a feeling of eagerness or knowing something before the characters do. Starting wide again, we'll let him walk over, and cut after the action, which creates a feeling of being held back or knowing something later than the characters. Cutting from a static shot to one with action, or vice versa, has the effect of suddenly speeding up or slowing down the pacing of the scene. Here we'll first start on the man in a static shot and then cut to the woman's walk into the scene. So starting on him, we're at rest. But cutting to her, the pace suddenly scoots ahead, which makes her appear more dynamic than him. Cutting into action usually creates a jolt and can be used for that purpose, for instance to open a new scene on a high note. Here we're starting on the woman and pan with her into the scene, but suddenly cut to a static shot on the man, which abruptly slows down the pace and makes him appear unmoving or rigid by comparison. When there's no action and nothing to follow across an edit, the cut likewise brings a lot of attention to itself, which can be used intentionally. Here the man is sitting by his desk, and as we cut wide to make him appear lonely, the cut deliberately brings attention to that. In piecing together coverage, we're trying to create the illusion that all cameras are recording the same moment, even though they're shot hours or days apart. It's naturally crucial that what we're shooting is repeatable, so that when editing, the characters will have identical postures on both sides of a cut. In this camera, the man is looking straight at the woman. But in this camera, shot later, he's looking into the ground while talking, so we're clearly not recording the same moment. We can only edit when each actor looks similar on both sides of the cut, which restricts the editing to those rare moments, and this can sometimes force us to use a lesser take for continuity reasons. So it's important for actors to know how to do repeatable body movement, and we need to be extremely adamant about getting it right. But if we're working with an actor who simply doesn't have good continuity, it's crucial that we make the choice to either simply edit less or to be absolutely sure to get single shots. In this close-up, we don't know what the woman is doing, so cutting to her, any body posture within reason is believable to have happened off camera. Going back to the man, he could reasonably have tilted his head in the meanwhile. Close-ups can literally save a scene that could otherwise be uncuttable. Cutting movement, we also notice immediately if the action on either side of the cut is at different speeds, which often flies under the radar when shooting. In the first camera, the man sits down fairly fast. And in the closer camera, shot later, he sits down slowly. As we cut it together, there's a sudden change of speed and the scene appears patched together. When cutting action, we need to obey the laws of physics. At the edit point, there's nothing that stops us from skipping ahead or back in time, which produces some unusual artifacts. Here the man sits down and we cut close, but we're cutting ahead in time, so we're missing a piece of time in the logic of the scene. Here the man sits down again, but part of his action is included twice. When we don't obey the laws of physics, the edit immediately brings attention to itself. When the man takes a natural amount of time to sit down, the edit is seamless. But as long as the action is repeatable, we can be reasonably sure that simply covering it from several angles will cut fine. We only need to be sure that each camera is rolling well before and well after the part we want to use, not just to have freedom in editing, but to get the actors up to speed before they're on, and to get any extra reactions. Finally, it's important to cover movement from the same side of the action in each camera, which ensures that the characters are moving in the same direction on the screen before and after the cut. This creates the same spatial continuity as honoring the line, because our left-right relationships stay the same. As we cut, the man's screen direction is left to right in both shots. So for the record, let's put the second camera on the wrong side. The man again walks from left to right. But as we cut, he's now moving right to left, which is a little surprising. The ability to skip forward or backward in time at the edit point is what allows us to control the pacing of a scene, and is one of the most expressive aspects of editing, or one of the most frustrating if the scene isn't shot right. So in this chapter, we want to look at creating maximum freedom to adjust timing in editing. The first freedom comes from having gaps between all lines of dialogue. Looking at the audio for a dialogue covered in two over the shoulders, the red waveforms are the man's lines and the blue waveforms are the woman's lines. Assuming that the characters have perfect continuity, we'll cut exactly in the middle on both sides of the edit, resulting in roughly the same timing as before. But if we use less of the gap both before and after the edit, we're speeding up time. If we use more of the gap both before and after the edit, we're essentially playing part of the same moment twice, resulting in a stretched out pause. But this is as far as we can stretch, because we need to cut before the other character starts speaking in each take, which is often visible even with their backs turned. In close-ups, we can stretch time much more by eating into the other character's dialogue on both sides of the cut. Since the other character isn't visible, all we have to do is mask out their sound with room tone, which we can find at the beginning and end of most takes. Gaps are what give us all the control in editing, so the longer gaps the better, at least from an editing perspective. This is pretty much common knowledge, but it's the first thing that goes out the window when shooting. It's sometimes hard to get actors to make gaps, and actors also often begin to step on each other's lines to work up a momentum, which makes editing very difficult, not to mention sound mixing. Interruptions are extremely hard to get rid of, but very easy to create after the fact. So if the scene needs one, it's better to get it clean and created in editing, which is where timing is really first created. The second freedom comes from cutaways. Anytime we cut between completely separate shots, we lose any time reference, and we can cut ahead or back in time on the next edit. This becomes important as we look at character movement, which we almost always want to cut shorter or longer. Here the man walks over to the woman. He walks. And walks. And since we're covering this in just one camera, we have no choice but to include the entire movement, which ultimately gets dull. So in order to shorten the movement, we'll place a cutaway on the woman. This gives us a reason to cut, which is essential if we want to change the timing. So starting on the man again, he walks, and we cut to the woman. When we cut back to him, we can simply cut ahead in time and make him arrive when we want to, unless we break the laws of physics by having him travel too far, too fast. In cheating timing for long walks, it's useful to notice that it's much harder to make out a character's position seen from the front than it is from the side. Doing the same thing from the side, the man's travel is much more visible. So as we cut away to the woman and back on the man, there's no way the man could have traveled this distance in this time. The key to stretching time is usually to simply get more angles of the same thing and therefore have more reasons to cut. Here the man has a fairly short walk, but we'll cover it in an exaggerated concoction of multiple angles, POVs, and cutaways. So starting in a wide shot, we'll cut to a close-up, then a POV, then an insert on his feet, a cutaway on the woman, back in another close-up, all the time playing the same moment over and over again, ending in this shot. A third freedom to change the timing of movement comes from avoiding visual references. The first way to do that is to frame cameras so we can't see the area being traveled. Here the man walks from this desk to this desk, so we'll place two cameras both shooting from the side. As he walks out of the first shot, he quickly clears the frame. The second shot is also from the side, so he steps in at the last minute. Without covering the movement, we have no way of knowing the distance between the two shots, so we're free to make up the timing and editing. We can of course create a cutaway to put in the middle if we need a long walk and we don't want to be parked on an empty frame. Starting in the first camera, he clears the frame. We go to the cutaway on the woman, stay here for as long as we want him to travel, then cut to the ending shot as he steps in. The second way to avoid visual references is to use a close-up of the action that's in open enough framing that we lose orientation. Here the man has a fairly long walk, which we'll cover by panning with him in a tight shot and end with having him step into a wider shot. Since we're covering him in a fairly narrow shot, we have no way of knowing exactly where he is. So we can again make him arrive when we want to by cutting to the ending of his next shot. We only perceive time on a very local level, and we only pick up errors in immediate continuity. But we can easily accept cutting out several days of the story if nothing interesting happens, because that's how we think. If the man walks from a scene in a forest to a scene in an office several days later in the story, we mentally simply bridge the gap. Cutting out long stretches of time is usually more an issue of writing than directing. But within the scene, we of course have the classic methods to compact time, like doing a montage. As we fade between a series of situations in the same location, we understand the intent and perceive time passing rapidly. And again, cutaways can be used to remove much longer stretches of time. Here the characters are waiting for an important phone call. We'll cut to a clock, which is maybe a little on the nose. But when we cut back, the fact that the characters are arranged differently tells us that time has passed. Finally, speed changes can very effectively change our perception of time. Shooting at a lower frame rate, the resulting motion is higher speed, which has very few uses, one of which is to speed up certain moments in action sequences. But shooting much slower, the result is time-lapse photography, which depicts a substantial passing of time quickly. Shooting at a higher frame rate, resulting in slow motion, is a powerful way to stretch out a moment that would have happened too fast in real time. Here the woman realizes that her neighbor is the murderer, which is a significant moment, so shooting at normal speed doesn't really convey the gravity. Shooting at high speed, we stretch out this crucial moment, which is extremely effective. As we begin to work with covering moving characters, let's first look at how to get the maximum mileage out of each single camera. The classic Hollywood way to cover scenes was to do very long takes with almost no editing and have the characters arrange themselves in front of the camera in a sort of theater on film. Creating the framing entirely by how we place the characters is the opposite of how most of us have learned to go about staging, but it's really the most essential method. So assuming for a moment that we only have one camera and we can't edit, we need to put the entire blocking effort into how we arrange the characters. Here the characters need to stop, but instead of having them stop randomly, we'll have them end in a deliberate framing. As the dialogue continues, we'll have the man walk over here. We'll then have the woman approach him, creating a symmetrical framing right in front of the camera. As a third character joins them and ends up exactly between them deeper into the frame, we've gotten an enormous amount of mileage out of this single shot. And we seem to always happen upon good framings by chance, which gives a sense of purpose to the blocking. But the great thing about this is the ability to transform the camera from one shot type to another. Looking again at the first shot, a right-angle master becomes an over-the-shoulder, which is even clearer as he turns. He leaves. The woman walks closer, and we're now a close-up single shot. He walks back in, and we're now a flipped over the shoulder. Even if we don't intend to do long takes like this, transforming a camera to a different shot type lets us use a camera for more than one thing, which is both economical and elegant. So in picking covers for moving characters, the first thing to look for is ways to have cameras serve double function, and for that let's build a small repertoire of moves that can be used in most scenes. The first is a single shot becoming an over-the-shoulder. Starting in a single shot on the woman, this is her shot for the first half of the scene. But when the man steps in, the shot is now an over-the-shoulder. The man is really just stepping into an over-the-shoulder, but since we didn't expect the camera to also function as that, it seems like a lucky coincidence that the framing works. It also creates the feeling of having more cameras than we really do. As the man steps in, it's clear that the camera is simply changing shape. But when we edit a scene with 5 such cameras together, they suddenly feel like 10, which theoretically cuts the shooting day in half, but is also easier to deal with. The key to doing this is to know where we're going. Here we've been cutting dialogue between 2 single shots. As the red woman talks, we cut to the blue woman. As the red woman now steps forwards, we've deliberately framed the blue woman's single shot so it can become an over-the-shoulder here, and the shot transforms very elegantly. Building an over-the-shoulder with a rear character is just as effective. Here we're in single shots on both the man and the woman. Starting on the woman, we cut a bit of dialogue between them. So having clearly established that we're seeing 2 single shots, the woman walks over into his shot, he turns, and we're now an over-the-shoulder. And to cover the dialogue, all we have to do is add a matching reverse here. Going from an over-the-shoulder back into a single shot doesn't produce the same transforming feeling because we've already seen the completed frame. But having her morph the shot into a close-up as he leaves, we've now gotten 3 distinct shot types out of a single camera, which makes the scene feel a lot more complex than it would have otherwise. Let's quickly go over some other transformations that are useful to have handy. The next one is reusing a camera while replacing a character. Here the man walks out, and we're now a single shot. After a while, the blue woman walks in where he stood before, transforming the shot back into an over-the-shoulder. Another move is turning an over-the-shoulder into another over-the-shoulder. So starting in one, the man walks to the other side of the woman, and we've essentially flipped it. Also, a relevant move is having a character isolate herself by moving close to the camera, which we'll cover in more detail later. Additionally, 2 particular framings are useful to arrive in as a result of movement, an over-the-shoulder and a right-angle master. Here the characters are walking through an office and will at some point stop for dialogue. So we'll have them stop in an over-the-shoulder in front of the camera. We could of course arrive in any framing, but a framing like this is more deliberate and can immediately become an integral part of the blocking if we add a reverse. After the man walks out, and the blue woman steps in creating an over-the-shoulder, let's do the same with the right-angle master. As they talk, we'll have them meet in a symmetrical shot here. Again, we could arrive in any kind of framing, but by arriving in mindful framings, the blocking feels more on track. As we do this with more characters, the key is to set up shots for when they contain the most characters, and then have the characters gradually build that frame by walking to their marks. Here the man is standing opposite the woman for the first half of the scene, then walks closer for dialogue with the red woman. So let's set up a 3-shot for the ending first. We'll arrange it as a right-angle master with a blue woman in the background. If we now move the man back to 1, this will be our shot on the women for the first part of the dialogue. And this will be our shot on the man. So cutting back and forth, it seems like normal dialogue. But when he walks over, we happen upon an excellent framing here. This works no matter how complex the framing is. Here we're covering 3 characters in separate shots for the first half of the scene, but they will ultimately join each other towards the middle. So let's set up a shot for that first and have the characters end in this framing. With these positions memorized, we'll now use this shot as the red man's single shot long before the ending. For cutting the initial dialogue, we're going back and forth between the red man's shot, the red woman's single shot, and the blue woman's shot, which is overlapping for spatial continuity. As the red woman walks over, she steps into a wide over the shoulder. As the blue woman walks over, she steps in front of the same shot, which is now visibly changed shape twice. Covering character movement is really about covering all the places the characters stop. This is extremely easy to do and adequately covers the vast majority of scenes. Let's start with a simple situation where the woman walks over to the man. She has a short dialogue with him, then walks out, but stops on her way out, turns for another dialogue, and finally leaves completely. It's usually easiest to start with the most central character positions and then work our way forwards and backwards in time, so let's place 2 reverses and a right-angle master for this dialogue. Before that, this camera works as a single shot on the man, and this camera can cover her initial walk. But let's also put in a camera for where she starts. When she walks out and stops, we've aimed her walk so this camera can function as an over-the-shoulder for this position. Let's put in a camera for before she turns, which will give us a personal view with her in front. After she turns, this camera can function as an over-the-shoulder, but let's also get 2 close-ups, one on her and one on the man. So that took about 10 seconds to plan. We're starting on the woman. The man says something to her. She walks over, and we cover the rest of her walk in this over-the-shoulder. His single shot is now an over-the-shoulder, and we can edit this part of the scene to taste using the 2 reverses and the right-angle master. We're in this over-the-shoulder as she walks out. The man thinks for a bit, then says something to her, causing her to stop. We cut to this over-the-shoulder for the second dialogue, which right now has her in front, and the close-up on the man. Back on her, she turns, and the shot becomes a reel over the shoulder. Here we have 2 close-ups and 2 over-the-shoulders to cut the dialogue from. We're in this over-the-shoulder as she leaves. Then cut to the man's close-up, where he stands for a bit, then walks out. That's really all there is to it. The only other thing to be aware of is having enough cameras running at any given time to have cutting options. In the beginning, the crossed-out cameras wouldn't be shooting anything useful. As soon as the woman walks, we can already cut the first camera. And for the next dialogue, we're editing between the 2 reverses and the master. As soon as she walks out, the master and the other reverse cease being useful, and the other cameras aren't useful until she stops again, so we depend on the current camera working. For the last dialogue, all 4 cameras set up for that are good. As she walks out, her close-up is quickly empty, but we'll leave the remaining 3 cameras running, especially the close-up on the man, which we planned on ending in. A thing that works well is to frame all stops for when they have the most characters in them, and then allow the characters to gradually build the framing for each stop. In this scene, the man and the woman are having some difficulties in their relationship, and the woman is trying to avoid him. So the rough plan is that she'll walk over here. He will follow, and not getting her attention, he'll walk over behind her. She'll then walk away again, and he'll again follow. The reason we're not being more particular is that we want to stage the scene as 2 or 3 framings that the characters will then move between, so right now we're only interested in the times the framings are complete. At some point in the beginning, both characters will be here, and we'll frame a shot for that. At a later point, both characters will be here, and we'll frame a shot for that. Later again, both characters are here, which we'll place a camera for here. For a last stop, let's go back to the first framing and reuse the first camera. But since the characters aren't moving at the same time, we get the effect of them building the framings. The first shot is complete. But as the woman walks away, she has the next shot to herself, although it's framed for 2 characters. The man also has an incomplete shot, although it's framed for 2. As he walks over to the woman, he steps into her shot and completes the framing. The third camera is right now a single shot on the woman, with space for the man to step into. So as the man steps out of the previous shot and into this one, he completes the framing. She walks back to the first shot, so this is now a single shot on him. And the first shot is a single shot on her, until he walks over and completes the framing. As long as we're not creating any line issues, simply covering the stops and allowing characters to move between them is all it takes. So let's move on to look at why exactly characters move. Unless we're doing completely improvised filmmaking, we're the ones deciding on character movement and not the actors. Some of us aren't comfortable having to decide every minute character movement, and some actors also feel restricted by meticulous blocking. But from an audience perspective, well-planned blocking is far more impactful than spontaneous movement, which often produces very random and unexpressive shots. So we naturally need to plan movement that emphasizes the psychology of the scene. One place to get ideas is by watching the rehearsals and notice when the actors feel like moving. But what we want to do in this chapter is build a list of motivations that we can use to write blocking that makes sense without any input. Characters move for the same reasons that people do, and the vast majority of movement falls into these categories: initiative, control or territory, discomfort, becoming more personal, and becoming more private. Initiative is anything a character does with a sense of purpose. First of all, characters usually have very literal things to do in a scene, which are often written in the script. Here the script says that the woman grooms a plant and then walks over to the phone while talking to the man. That by itself dictates where to place cameras and actors and provides a framework to build the rest of the scene from. But just as often, the script says nothing, and if we don't invent some movement, the characters would be standing still. So continuing with initiative, one good motivation for movement is when a character gets excited or passionate about what he's saying. In this scene, a CEO of a huge company is trying to convince his board of directors to approve a merger, something he's very passionate about, which would be a good line to start moving on. So as he gives everybody a pep talk about how this would create one of the largest companies in the world and benefit all of them financially beyond belief, he walks. Another kind of initiative is when a character is curious or wants to find something out. In this scene, she is doing all the talking, but to make it more interesting, we've made the man go to a couple of places in the room to examine arbitrary things. Curiosity clearly motivates movement between the characters as well. After some regular dialogue, the man becomes interested in what the woman is saying, so we'll have him step forwards. The same move works equally well if he's asking a question. Initiative is also when a character makes the choice to change the direction of the scene. Here the man decides to end the conversation, so he begins walking, stopping one last time, then leaves completely. While it usually says in the script when a character leaves, it can be useful to start the process sooner and do it in several steps. Control or territory is about a character taking a dominant position by walking around a room like he owns it, just as animals mark their territory. Here the man in the suit is an unwelcome guest in the other character's territory, but as he walks calmly through the scene, he demonstrates his superiority by claiming freedom to move where he wants and stand where he wants. An effective use for this is to have a character step closer to another character the right moment in the dialogue to seem imposing or threatening. Here the man crosses a territorial boundary and invades her space. On a less overt level, we can use control to add drama or punch to a character's lines. Here the man makes an important speech, and by moving he takes control of the scene, but his purpose is to get everyone's attention and not necessarily to take over their territory. Discomfort is a big reason why people move in real life. When we're feeling uncomfortable, it's like something is gnawing at us, and we want to move to shake the feeling off, or at least avoid standing still. Here the woman is uncomfortable as she's waiting for the results of a job interview, so she moves to avoid feeling and to dissipate the energy. It's easiest to block if we plan to have the character move between a set number of stops instead of moving at random, so we don't have to set up an infinite number of cameras. Discomfort can bring subtle meaning to a conversation. Here the man and the woman are talking, and as he addresses something she may be lying about, she walks over here, which makes her discomfort quite clear. It's very common for people to cover up discomfort with movement that seems to have a purpose. In the shot from earlier, the man could just as well be pretending to be curious about objects in the room, but really be trying to hide his discomfort. Discomfort can also be positive. If a character is very excited or eager, he has a lot of bubbling energy he needs to expend somehow. Here the character has received terrific news, so he can't help but move. Becoming more personal is when a character moves closer to another character to become more intimate, more confidential, or more sincere. Here the man tries to convince his ex-wife that they should get back together, at least for the sake of the children. So as he becomes more personal and unguarded, he steps forwards. Becoming more personal usually means stepping closer, but it can simply mean making oneself visible to the other character. Here the man steps closer, but the woman turns away. So we'll have him walk over on the other side and into another shot. The woman turns back, and the man steps back into the previous shot again. A lot of scenes have one character trying to become more personal with the other, and designing the movement as a continuous attempt at this can bring action to a scene that doesn't automatically have any. Finally, becoming more private is the opposite. Here the character walks away, which can either mean some form of emotional withdrawal or rejection, or just a desire to be a little more private. A lot of character movement is really an alternating dance between becoming more personal and becoming more private. So moving between a couple of marks, it's fairly easy to create motivated and organized action as long as the dialogue calls for it. Equally useful is to look at why characters stop moving. Here we'll work with 5 reasons: stopping to end movement, stopping to think or feel, stopping to shift gears, stopping for clarity, and stopping for the camera. As with the reasons for movement, none of these exist in a vacuum and often overlap. Stopping to end movement seems very obvious, but what is meant by that is stopping when the motivations we looked at in the last chapter no longer exist. Here the blue woman is rushing to pack her bags to go see her boyfriend who's been working in a different country, so that would be highly motivated initiative. But the red woman knows that the boyfriend hasn't been faithful and finally breaks it to her. The blue woman slows to a halt, suddenly lacking purpose. Here the woman is moving away to become less personal because the man doesn't want to be open about something. As he begins opening up, she no longer has that reason and stops. Stopping to think or feel is interesting because as soon as something grabs our attention, we forget to move. Here the character is moving from point A to point B, but suddenly remembers something and stops to think. Seen like this, it's almost amusing because it shows how few things we're really able to do at the same time. A classic example of stopping to think is when a character leaves a dialogue. Here the man walks out, but suddenly thinks of something to say or changes his mind about something, so he stops as he considers. Here the woman leaves a conversation, but stops for a moment to feel and reflect on it. Again, as soon as her attention goes inwards into her emotional and mental world, she loses awareness of the physical world and forgets to move. Another example of stopping to feel is when 2 characters are walking and their dialogue suddenly becomes more sincere. So they stop in front of the camera for more personal dialogue. Stopping to shift gears is a momentary stop that happens as a prelude to another movement. If we continue with one of the previous examples, let's say the man hasn't had the courage to express his true feelings. But as he realizes that this may be his last chance, he stops to gather courage. then turns around and begins to become more personal again. In this scene, the red man has been very overbearing. As he walks out, he's essentially becoming more private. But as one of the other characters yells an insult, he stops to shift gears, then turns around and walks closer to appear threatening, which is motivated by control or territory. We're really just doing two movements back to back, but inserting a little pause to break it up emphasizes the change more. In this scene, the woman is busy with legitimate purpose, so the movement is based on initiative. Suddenly the man begins asking questions about something that makes her wonder if he knows a certain secret, so we want to switch to discomfort. The extra pause as we shift gears says it all. Stopping for clarity serves to emphasize and underline something. In the last chapter, the man brought extra attention and importance to what he was saying by moving. Stopping at just the right moment, the man suddenly becomes very direct, which brings particular focus to that line. The example from before where the women stop in front of the camera also brings clarity. As they stop, the scene becomes more focused and we pay new attention to what they're saying. The last motivation is deliberately stopping in front of the camera for the sole purpose of showing the character to us and deserves its own separate discussion. As the man walks in, he stops for a moment right in front of the camera for the only reason of giving us insight, then continues out of the frame. This is, of course, very easily stopping to think or feel. Here the woman leaves a dialogue and stops to reflect for a moment, but it's clear that the reason she's stopping here is that that's where the camera is. What it does is give us a unique perspective, and it allows us to know something about the character or to know that there's something we don't know, which in any case brings us deeper into the story. The great thing from a storytelling perspective is that we get to see something that no one else in the story gets to see. In a corny but effective example, a government building is under heavy security to protect against aliens disguised as humans. As a Secret Service agent walks past us, he stops, there's a red glow in his eyes, and we suddenly know something the characters don't, which does a great job at drawing us in. Last but not least is a simple reaction shot where a character stands for a moment at the end of a scene. Here the man has had a conversation with a woman, who then walks out. The simple fact that he stands for a moment turns it into a thinking or feeling shot, and there's no need to act it or be heavy-handed about it. A variation that's just as useful is to have him walk out after a moment of thinking or feeling. Again, the woman walks out. He stands for a moment, which adds instant depth, even if there's no particular motivation for it, and then walks out, clearing the frame. The only difference here is that ending on the reaction with no movement makes the character look a little more punched out. And ending with him walking out makes him look a little more active, so the thinking and feeling only last for a moment. At this point, let's stage a scene to try out the motivations from the last two chapters. This scene is between two attorneys, Jennifer and Damien, who used to be dating but are now just working together on a case. Damien's ego is having a hard time with the fact that Jennifer is seeing other people, but he's not the kind of person who admits defeat, even to himself. The script can be downloaded from hollywoodcamerawork.us/downloads.html. Let's do a read-through. Jennifer is busy looking for the deposition.
So, where do you go from here?
I get a subpoena to make them cough up, and I'll be back in court before hot pants in the morning.
Jennifer, are you sure you're... Never mind.
No, tell me.
Well, your fantasy.
You're still thinking about that. You know, you're not in it. Anymore, anyway.
That's not where I was going.
Where were you going?
Jennifer. Jen. Can I still call you Jen? The thing is, it's really great when a person has a healthy fantasy life and is really in touch with her or his dreams. You know, it shows depth.
$5 if you can spell that word.
But just so you know, I'm not judging you or anything.
Jennifer frowns and shakes her head.
Anyway, I'll be...
He turns and leaves.
It was nice to see him again, huh?
Who?
Mike.
Oh, him. He's, just a friend.
Oh, okay.
He leaves. There are plenty of subtle opportunities for motivated movement in this scene. To start, Jennifer's movement comes from a mixture of discomfort regarding the case and a desire to become less personal with Damien, who's being a bit obnoxious. In any case, she wants to stay busy, and the script also says that she's looking for a deposition, so the first thing we'll do is create a couple of marks she can move between. We'll put 2 marks at either end of the table, which will be the main marks. Halfway through the scene, Damien essentially says it's okay she once had a fantasy about him, which she finds mind-boggling, so we'll place a 3rd mark in the middle for becoming curious or more personal. We'll simply label the marks 1, 2, and 3. We'll place Damien here, which puts him almost in the middle of where Jennifer needs to walk, so he clearly doesn't care that she's busy. He only has 1 movement towards the end where he walks out, but stops to shift gears, so that's 2 marks. Next, let's cover the stops. We'll start with a camera on Jennifer with Damien in the background. For covering Jennifer's movement between marks 1 and 2, we can pan this camera to transform it into a flipped over the shoulder, which we'll cover in more detail later. We'll cover Jennifer's 3rd stop with a camera here, which we're placing like this to avoid a line problem, which we'll also look at later. Back on her 1st stop, let's also place an internal shot on Damien, which we can again pan to make work for Jennifer's 1st and 2nd marks. This camera is in her path, so she'll have to move behind the camera for that take, which is fine as long as his eye line is the same. Towards the middle of the scene, where Damien's long line shows that he's completely misunderstood the situation, this is the mark she'll walk to out of curiosity or becoming more personal. So let's add a close-up here. As the scene draws to a close, we'll have her walk back to the 1st mark, which is the best covered mark. This is where Damien walks out and stops to think or feel or shift gears. We'll cover that in the same close-up as before, but let's add a matching internal reverse on Jennifer. He walks out completely, and we hold on her as she stops to reflect for a moment, after which she walks out of the frame to stay active. So as we've covered these stops in 5 cameras, let's now work on the timing of movement between the marks. All we'll do here is note the movement between the numbered marks, which is an easy and intuitive way to time it to the melody of the script. In the beginning, we'll have Jennifer start on her mark 2 in the middle and walk to mark 1 during her line to immediately make her look busy. After a little dialogue, let's have her walk to mark 3, timing the walk to end here. As Damien does his long line, we'll have her listen for a bit and then walk to the middle mark. Here she'll stay for her next line and then walk back to mark 1 in time to frown and shake her head. Damien stands awkwardly for a moment, then walks out, which is between his 2 only marks. He stops and turns for a last line, after which he walks out of the room. Finally, we'll have Jennifer stand for a bit to think and feel, and then walk out of the shot to end the scene. With that laid down, let's shoot it and cut it together.
So, where do you go from here?
I get a subpoena to make them cough up, and I'll be back in court before hot pants in the morning.
Jennifer, are you sure you're... Never mind.
No, tell me.
Well, your fantasy.
You're still thinking about that. You know, you're not in it. Anymore, anyway.
That's not where I was going.
Where were you going?
Jennifer. Jen. Can I still call you Jen? The thing is, it's really great when a person has a healthy fantasy life and is really in touch with her or his dreams. You know, it shows depth.
$5 if you can spell that word.
But just so you know, I'm not judging you or anything. Anyway, I'll be... It was nice to see him again, huh?
Who?
Mike.
Oh, him. He's, just a friend.
Oh, okay.
In this chapter, we'll continue looking at reasons for character movement by looking at how the characters are facing each other. We could just leave this to the actors, but it very quickly becomes a blocking decision because it affects how we'll want to place cameras. Here we want the woman to appear reserved, but without turning away, there's really nothing else she can do with her performance to bring that across. If she turns away, we'll need a camera over here to really get the effect. So major body language is a blocking decision and therefore up to us. The problem is that many of us feel awkward setting up shots like this because it's very melodramatic. A melodrama is a drama with exaggerated emotions, and in real life this kind of body language is clearly over the top, but in blocking it's one of the most powerful means of expression. So the primary purpose of this chapter is to make it okay to be melodramatic and theatrical, because it's still the most effective way to show emotions. The way we'll look at the direction a character is facing is to see it as varying degrees of intimacy, honesty, and power. Starting with intimacy, the woman is facing the man, so she's being 100% intimate or open or available. As she turns a bit, she withdraws emotionally a little. And if she turns away, she's being completely closed and unavailable. This obviously works great if a character for whatever reason wants to be more private, but another benefit is that if we're outside the dialogue, she's still allowing us to be identified with her, which gives us personal and private insight. This is also great for making a character appear detached or arrogant. Throughout this scene, we'll place the man at a right angle to her, so he never lets her connect with him. This could be a rejection, but it also could be that he doesn't want to appear to care. If we cover this in over the shoulders, he's also standing sideways to us, so we get the same impression. But if we cover it in right-angle cameras, we're getting a completely personal view in one of the cameras, while he's still detached seen from her vantage point. Honesty is similar in that facing another character directly is the most revealing and makes it very hard to keep a secret. But as the man turns even just slightly, his body language shows us that he's less than truthful and therefore less willing to face her. Obviously, we're able to override our body language intentionally, but if we're not paying attention, dishonesty or insincerity will make us turn slightly away. As he turns away completely, he clearly has something to hide, but we're not making a judgment about what it is he's hiding, just that he is. So the body language is the same, whether he's hiding an evil scheme, hiding his true feelings, or is ashamed of something. Power is a little more complex because it can be used two opposite ways. The first is again that when a person is facing another head-on, the body language shows the most confidence and power. If the woman is a strong and dominant character, the man will tend to turn slightly to the side to show that he's not challenging her territory. So being direct equals being powerful, and being less direct is less powerful. But power is often created through manipulation by withdrawing intimacy, which creates the opposite body language. As the woman turns away from the man, she gets the upper hand by shutting him out, and he now has to give something up to regain the intimacy. This is a powerful ploy which people do in real life as well, though maybe not as explicitly. The only thing that makes this melodrama is exaggerating it, which tends to feel very natural on film. But if we simply don't like the melodramatic feeling, let's look at a couple of ways to get the same effect in a less overt way. The only really melodramatic shot is when a character is facing away completely. If the woman becomes sad and suddenly turns away, it can come across as very staged and remind us of an old Hollywood musical. One way to avoid this is to combine it with some stage business. So starting again at the top, something in the scene causes the woman to want to withdraw. Instead of just having her turn, we'll have her walk over to the table for a reason we don't even need to explain. We arrive in essentially the same shot, but it blends much better into the scene. Another way is starting a scene with a character facing away. Here the woman walks in, finding the man facing away. Since we're not seeing him turn, it doesn't call as much attention to itself and is a plausible way for him to happen to be standing. Finally, a thing to notice when characters aren't facing each other is that there's no need to worry about having one or both of them talk out in the thin air. If we looked at this objectively, the man would actually have to talk louder to be heard. But from within the scene, their dialogue is connected through the story, which creates an intimate atmosphere even with distance between them, so they can both speak normally. Let's stage a quick scene to see what kind of subtle difference these distinctions bring to the blocking. The scene we'll do here is a very simple one between a father and a daughter. The father, John, has found out that his daughter, Amy, has lied about where she was today. We'll first shoot a version where we make no choices about which way the characters are facing, so let's skip the read-through and go straight to a cut.
The school called. They said you never came in.
What a bunch of liars. My ankle got twisted in gym and I was late for one class.
You seem to be doing fine now.
Did Mrs. Tweed call? How can you believe her over your own daughter?
You used to be such a nice little girl. I could always believe anything you told me. Now I don't know what to think. Amy, are you even paying attention?
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you feel you can tell me what's going on? I'm sure I can understand it, whatever it is.
Okay, Dad.
Come on, treasure, you can tell me.
I'm not your treasure, okay? I'm not your gem. I'm not your jewel, all right? And you don't understand anything, Dad.
If we did it like this, probably nobody would ever question it, but let's try to make it more expressive by working with the direction the characters are facing. Let's first work on John. If we start the scene with him facing away from Amy, it first of all means that he knows Amy is coming and he's been waiting for her, so he's much more prepared and in control of the situation. By facing away, he's also punishing her by withdrawing his intimacy. On the line, "You seem to be doing fine now," let's have him turn to face her head on. He's now being completely direct with her, and we're really going from one form of power to another. Next, we'll work on Amy. Throughout the scene, John is questioning whether or not she's telling the truth. So she'll not want to face him head on because that would be too revealing. But in the beginning of this scene, John is facing away from her, so she doesn't need to turn away in order to hide. When John turns directly towards her, let's have her pretend to be confident and honest by continuing to face him directly. But since she knows she's lying, let's have her gradually turn to the side to be less revealing. However, at the end, when John calls her a treasure, it's easy for her to be direct because it's the truth that she doesn't like that name. If we now set up the cameras as before and shoot 4 full takes, we can make all other choices in editing. So let's view the cut of this version.
The school called. They said you never came in.
What a bunch of liars. My ankle got twisted in gym and I was late for 1 class.
You seem to be doing fine now.
Did Mrs. Tweed call? How can you believe her over your own daughter?
You used to be such a nice little girl. I could always believe anything you told me. Now I don't know what to think. Amy, are you even paying attention?
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you feel you can tell me what's going on? I'm sure I can understand it, whatever it is.
Okay, Dad.
Come on, treasure, you can tell me.
I'm not your treasure, okay? I'm not your gem. I'm not your jewel, all right? And you don't understand anything, Dad.
Continuing now with how to cover stops, an inevitable consequence of moving characters is that the lines between them are moving as well. Sometimes this movement causes a line cross. Line crosses essentially happen when characters pass in front of or behind each other. If we're set up like this and the woman moves over here, there's no line cross. But the moment she passes behind the man, we're crossing the line. And if the man passes in front of her, we're again crossing the line. Anytime a main character passes in front of or behind another, we should have a red flag go up, not because line crossing is wrong, but because we have to be alert for the consequences of it. The consequence of a line cross is that it can easily cause any number of cameras to suddenly be on the wrong side of the line, and if we don't manage this carefully, we risk ending up with an uncuttable scene. Starting with a simple test situation, we've set up an over-the-shoulder pair. As the woman moves to a new stop, one of the cameras is now on the wrong side of the line. What determines which side we're on is which camera sees the movement. If we're in this camera she moves, that's the side we're on, and any new cameras need to go on the same side. If we're in this camera she moves, any new cameras need to go on this side instead. This is pretty straightforward when there's no line cross during the move itself, but when there is one, we suddenly have to be very careful about how we cut it. To look at that, let's create a third stop where the man has walked over here, and again add an over-the-shoulder pair. No matter which way we edit this, we're dealing with at least one line cross. Starting in this camera, we have a couple of choices, starting with cutting from here to here. As the man walks, we're almost immediately on the other side of the line. Let's pause here because we can't cut to the other reverse, which is right now on the wrong side of the line, until the line crosses that camera too. So if we let the line cross the first camera, we have to stay there until the line has crossed the second camera, putting it again on our side of the line. The other way to cut between these two cameras is to jump ahead of the line. Starting in the first reverse, the man barely moves before we have to jump ahead of the line to avoid having it cross us. so the line cross doesn't actually happen until here. Going to the other reverse, we only have one option. Right now it's on the wrong side of the line, so we have to let the line cross us first. We can then at our leisure cut to the other reverse. And going from the other reverse on the original line, there's again only one cutting option. As the man walks, we have to cut to this camera while we're still on the same side of the line, or we'd end up alone on the wrong side of the line. So let's cut all 4 versions together to see which ones work better. In the first version, we stayed in the first camera and waited until the line had crossed the second camera. In the next version, we jumped ahead of the line. So as the man moves, we have to jump immediately and then wait in the next camera for the line cross. Since the woman looks nearly identical in both cameras, this is not a good cut, and both of these options give us the feeling that we're trying to escape the line. The best and most relaxed options are the 2 last ones. As the man walks, we're immediately on the right side of the line for the next camera, so the cut isn't motivated by trying to escape the line. Going from the opposite reverse, we can again do a fairly relaxed cut, as long as we make it into the next camera before the line cross. Going back again, we likewise have 4 options. Starting in the same reverse, the first option again is to skip ahead of the line. So the line cross doesn't happen until here. If we let the line cross happen, we have to hold in this shot while we wait for the next camera to be on our side. But since the cut is easier and more relaxed, if we don't have to stress ahead to avoid the line, let's just have him cross it and cut to this reverse, which then becomes an over the shoulder whenever the time is right. Again from the opposite reverse, the man walks out, and we can cut to this reverse when we want, as long as we do it before the line cross here. With these things in mind, let's return to the earlier script staging between the 2 attorneys to look at what we were doing to manage the line. The 2 main cameras were this over the shoulder and this close-up, which we used to basically divide the scene in half. So as Jennifer moved between her second and first marks, both cameras stayed useful. For the part where Jennifer needed to walk from her first to her third mark, we deliberately set up these 2 cameras close enough together that as soon as she caused the line cross, we would have a valid camera to cut to. When she walked to her second mark in the middle, we made the choice to already be in one of these cameras so that all we'd have to do to complete the coverage was add a close-up on her, matching Damien's continuous close-up. Since we needed to get back into this camera to get her facial expression as she walked back to her first mark, we had to get back before the line crossed it, or we would have had no way to get there. Finally, as Damien left, we knew we were going to be in his close-up to cover him stopping on the way out, which is why we added the last close-up on Jennifer on this side of the line and at a matching distance. Unless we completely avoid having moving lines cross cameras, which of course works but also produces very flat blocking, we sometimes need to engineer scenes this precisely. Combined with the hinging and pivoting we have to do to manage the line for static dialogue, things can start to get pretty complicated, and almost everybody has at least some difficulty with this. But let's look at some techniques to make managing moving lines very easy. By far the easiest way to manage the line with moving characters is to simply follow the line around the scene and place cameras based on which side we believe we're on at each particular time. So if the dialogue starts here, let's add 2 reverses, putting us on this side of the line. Next we'll have the woman walk over here, and again add 2 reverses. As she moves, we either have to be in this camera, in which case we can cut to this camera when we want, and to this camera as soon as the line has crossed it. If we're starting her walk in this camera, we have to cut ahead of the line before it crosses us, or we'll end up on the wrong side. Then the man walks over to her, and for that we'll place a 2-shot here. For getting into this camera, we'll have to be in this one for the walk. And as soon as the line has crossed the new camera, we can cut to it. Finally, let's have the woman walk over here, for which the line stays virtually the same, and let's add a camera of similar size and angle as this one for dialogue. So even though the line is zigzagging through the scene, this is very easy to deal with. For her walk, let's be in the camera that needs to cut ahead of the line. Just before she passes behind the man, we'll have to cut to this reverse. But we'll have to wait with cutting to the matching reverse until the line has crossed it. As the man walks over, we'll want to cut to the next 2-shot, which we can do as soon as the line is past it, so the man is to the left of the woman in both shots. And as the woman walks to her third stop, we've set up this camera to match the man's camera, which has now become a single shot, so we can cut the remaining dialogue between these two shots. Another method that can make dealing with moving lines easier is to stick to a major coverage angle. If we choose to generally cover the scene in this direction, what we'll do is always place cameras on the side of the line that's facing towards us. So for the first stop, the cameras go here. As the woman walks over here, we'll again place a reverse pair on our side of the line. Finally, as the man walks over here, we'll put in another reverse pair, also on the side of the line facing the major covered side. We can do this without engaging in heavy thought, and it usually ends up cutting well. After starting on the man, the woman walks, and we go to this reverse, which she steps into and completes. Continuing the dialogue with the reverse on that line, we go back to the over the shoulder from behind the man. He walks, crossing the line immediately, and we cut to this over the shoulder, which he steps into, and the other reverse to finish the dialogue. Sticking to a major coverage angle becomes especially important when the characters are far away from each other, which can make it hard to figure out exactly which side of the line we're on. In this scene, the characters start out away from each other, after which the man walks over here. So let's make a common mistake and set up two cameras like this, which by itself honors the line. But then pan with the man as he walks to a second mark. If we draw in the line, we've now ended up with two cameras on opposite sides. What we need to do is make clear choices about which side we're on. If the line will be moving around this area, we're much safer if we stay on the good side of all positions, so let's simply move his camera over here. From above, it's very obvious, but it's an easy trap to walk into. As we looked at in the chapter on U, I, and O shapes, placing cameras so they work for as many lines as possible is the safest way to keep track of lines. To do the same with moving lines, let's create some action, but draw every character stop as if it were a separate and static character with an unmoving line, and then solve it the same way we did in that chapter. In this unnecessarily messy scene, we'll start with the characters like this, then have the blue man walk over here, and after a while have the red man walk over here. In the beginning, the woman has dialogue with them both, creating two lines. They might also have dialogue with each other, creating a line here. After the blue man has walked to his second mark, he again has dialogue with them both. For the stop where the red man has walked over to the woman, he'll of course have dialogue with her, and the blue man will add some comments. Treating each stop as a separate character, let's put in cameras starting with an internal shot on the woman, which will sandwich in between these two pairs of lines, so it'll basically work throughout the scene. Let's add two close-ups for each of the men at their first stops, and an external reverse pair to cover the first half of the scene a little wider. As the blue man has walked over here, we're more interested in these lines, so let's add a close-up here. The woman's close-up keeps working, and we can cut dialogue between the men with these two cameras, although the angle gets a little strained. When the red man has walked to his second mark, we're now only concerned with these lines. As with the blue man, we'll add a close-up on the red man, and a wide shot to function as reverse, while the woman's close-up works the same. That's it, and the only other thing we'll do is take the two close-ups on the blue man's stops, which are single shots from almost the same location, and combine them into a single camera that pans. As he walks, we'll still get the two shots we need and have his movement covered as well. So to quickly cut this together, let's start in this 3-shot. Then go to the close-up on the blue man, the close-up on the woman, and the close-up on the red man. For more personal dialogue between him and the woman, we'll cut between this reverse, which is a 2-shot, and the 3-shot. The blue man walks, and we pan with him over to his next stop, where the woman's close-up is still good. She turns back to the red man. We go to the reverse 2-shot again. The man walks, and we cut to this reverse for his arrival, which we can relax about because we're on the good side of the line throughout. To finish the dialogue here, we'll use this camera, the blue man's close-up, which was now the result of a pan instead of a lock camera, the close-up on the woman, and the close-up on the red man. So by placing phantom characters at each of the stops and then covering it as if it were static dialogue is very straightforward. A thing we did in the last scene that's worth looking more at is sandwiching cameras between lines. One would generally think that cameras placed in the middle of the scene would create more line problems, but they often end up working for both sides of the line. In this scene, the man will walk over here, so we'll sandwich the close-up on the woman between the two lines and add a couple of reverses on the man. So starting in one of those reverses, we're in the close-up as the man walks to his second stop. With her camera between the lines, it works for both sides. This would also have solved the situation from before with the characters away from each other. If we'd drawn in the lines, we could have placed a single panning camera on the man and sandwiched her camera between the lines. The last thing we'll work with is to avoid what we'll call sweeping lines. To look at that, let's first look at a character moving between 2 points covered in 2 cameras. As he walks out of the first shot, he simply walks into the second, and we're fine because his walk creates a line here. But if we bring in a second character, we're suddenly dealing with a line going this way, and no matter how we set it up, we're going to have line problems. As the man walks out of the first shot, there's an immediate line cross and we're on the wrong side. But more than that, we have to hold in this camera until the line is past the other one. This can become a real head scratcher. If we try to better it by moving the first camera out here, we eliminate the first line cross, but we're still forced to hold in this shot until the line crosses the other camera. We could try other combinations, but the bottom line is that any arrangement that causes the line to sweep through several cameras is going to be a headache to edit. If we return to the first script staging, we had Jennifer moving between these 2 points, and we could easily have wanted to simply do 2 over the shoulders, one here and one here. If we'd set it up like that, we would have had a long gap in her walk with no editing options. So what we did instead was modify the camera for a second stop to get them close together, giving us a camera to cut to immediately. As she walked out of the first shot, she could immediately step into the second, and we wouldn't have to wait for a line cross to finish. In order to work more with managing moving lines, we need some real situations, so let's hold for now and deal with it again on Volume 5 and 6. For the remaining part of this volume, we'll work with creating the maximum amount of depth in the frame. A frame of film is inherently two-dimensional, and shots made without any consideration about depth often come across as flat and uninteresting. But depth doesn't come automatically, and we have to work at creating the illusion of it. However, it's also an extremely creative aspect of staging because it allows us to direct the attention in and out of the frame, which gives us a whole other means of expression. Before we get started on that, we need to look at a couple of things. First of all, depth is created by arranging shots in layers or planes. So while the characters may be in a middle plane, we're bringing in some extras for a background plane, a plant for a foreground plane, and a third character in an even closer foreground plane. This is a helpful way to look at it because the way we create attention shifts between depths is really by sliding planes in and out, as here where the third character steps in and out. So the plane actually exists before we slide it into the frame. Or by shifting focus between planes, or very often by doing both at the same time. Secondly, shifting focus or racking focus is both a necessary aspect of working with depth because it's usually impossible to keep the entire scene in focus at the same time, but it's also an aspect that looks so good it's often a goal in itself. However, a crucial distinction to make here is that all we should be concerned with is creating layers. When we're blocking, it's much too early to be concerned with focus, but if we make sure to block with an eye on depth, we can have focus be one of the last decisions we make minutes before shooting. This means that if we imagine a shot where we rack focus from a clock over on a character, all we should be concerned with is creating 2 layers. At the last minute before shooting, we can then decide on how and when to rack focus. This is better because it ensures that we're always going for the most meaningful compositions, and racking focus then simply becomes icing on the cake. So in the next chapters, we'll work exclusively with staging for depth, and then take the discussion on focus afterwards. Before we get into the really interesting ways to use depth, let's work with foreground and background planes. Many shots can be helped by either putting something in the foreground or by finding something to shoot through. Here we're bringing in a plant, but it could be anything, and it's usually much less intrusive than one would think because the focus on the characters will blur it out. We'll call this arbitrary foreground because it's almost irrelevant what it is. Here the characters are at a party, but let's bring some partygoers into the foreground, which helps the main characters blend in as well as enhances the depth. Here we framed a phone in the foreground as the man walks into the scene. Here we've placed a lamp in the foreground for no other reason than creating depth. But having it continue outside the frame also makes the scene part of a real world, as we looked at in the chapter on open and closed framings. The more foreground we put in, the more we often get the sense of hiding behind something. Here the branches simply create interesting foreground, but if we put them very close together, we get the classic stalker shot where we're really seeing the scene from a bad guy's POV. The other way to do this is to place cameras to get objects on the set into the foreground. Here the characters are having dialogue between some columns, and we could of course frame it like this, which is quite flat. So let's move over here to get one of the columns in the foreground. Here we're framing the car in the foreground. Or we could move over here to get the fence in the foreground too. When we're using fixed objects for foreground, it's best if we can work it out in advance so we can weave it into the camera plot without having to make big changes on the set. A more explicit way to create foreground is to create frames within the frame. This is a great framing tool even if we're not using it to get depth, as here where the character is standing in a doorway and on the same plane. But the same type of shot from outside a room uses the doorway to make a frame within the frame, with the edges of the doorway as arbitrary foreground, creating a separate layer. Frames within the frame very effectively direct our attention. Here we're shooting through a door that's barely open, and since there's nothing else to look at, that's where our attention goes. Returning to the shot with the columns in the foreground, we're really masking out part of the frame. If we mask it out more, we're deliberately directing our attention to the right. We can use anything to create a frame within the frame. Here we're using two characters to frame the third character in the background. Here we're framing the man inside the arm of the lamp. Here we're using a gap in the foreground created by the man to frame the woman in the background. Very overt use of foreground is best to plan ahead of time so it's built into the blocking. But we can very often simply modify a shot to create a frame within a frame with no particular impact on the camera plot, which is easily done on the set. Here we have a shot on a man working at a panel of computers, and the screens already provide decent foreground. But without really changing the blocking, we can instead frame the shot between the two screens, creating a frame and directing our attention towards the man. The last kind of foreground we'll look at for now is moving foreground. If we're shooting dialogue between the characters, it's very easy to create a plane of extras that occasionally pass through the shot and bring added depth. This really works the same with background, so if we start that plane moving too, we now have 3 layers of depth, 2 of them arbitrary. Whether it's foreground or background, it can be very effective to include extras in the blocking as if they were main characters, except that they have no function. To do that with foreground, the 2 men will have dialogue deeper into the scene, but we'll place an arbitrary character out front, which gives both depth and ambience. So the shot is framed to include her, even though she has no function in the scene. However, when we're placing a well-framed arbitrary character close to the camera, we often seem to imply a meaning and significance that might not be there. But as background, it's very decorative to incorporate extras into the blocking and use them to fill in gaps in the framing. Here we've set up for 2 character dialogue, and with that down, let's bring in a couple of extras as part of the framing. We've already been doing this habitually, as in this scene from Temporal Continuity where the woman walks in and we cut to the man's shot where we've built 2 extras into the framing. Or in this shot from the same chapter where the man steps into the shot. Or in this shot from Expanding and Contracting Time, where we pan with the man as he walks in, having deliberately placed the extras in the background as part of the framing. This, of course, works just as well with props. In this shot from Motivations for Stopping, the woman leaves the conversation but stops on the way out. We've placed the piece of furniture in the background to fit with her stop to get a more deliberate framing. This is very easy and can be a late decision, because after having set up the shot we want, all we have to do is begin decorating the frame to make it perfect. Lastly, we might not always have control over the background itself, in which case it makes sense to frame for the most pleasing part of it. In this scene we're framing for the ocean, and the subtle movement from the waves will add a nice level to the shot. Where in the last chapter we had one central plane and used foreground and background to create depth, deep staging is creating depth with the characters and meaningful objects that are actively part of the scene. Deep staging creates very vivid and three-dimensional staging that's richer and more fun to watch because the shot takes longer to read, so it can stay on screen longer. As the eye scans the frame, we might start by looking at the man, then at the two characters here, then discover the blue woman in the background, and then discover the red woman's facial expression. Our attention goes to the man as he talks, then to the woman in the background for her dialogue, and we might take a quick glance at the extra. By now we'll have gone for half a minute without a single cut and without getting bored. In contrast, a single shot has only one layer and gets tired much faster. Deep staging shots are much more engaging because we capture more than one story in the same shot. As the men talk with each other, the woman is thinking about something else. By layering it instead of doing two separate shots, as we're trying to follow both stories at the same time, we're participating instead of just watching. What makes deep staging dynamic is that we're creating distinct layers of meaning. If the sign had been a bush, our eyes wouldn't be scanning in and out of the frame to read it. We could, of course, place everything on the same plane, but by using depth, we tell a story more clearly by showing the audience the distinct layers they need to be concerned with. There are really two sides to deep staging. The first, creating static and self-contained deep staging as we just did, and the second, creating attention shifts between depths by having characters or objects move in and out of shots. We'll split this over 2 chapters, starting with static deep staging. To do deep staging, all we have to do is get in the habit of telling more than one story at the same time and arrange stories in layers to create maximum depth. Here 2 doctors are talking about a patient in a coma. So an obvious choice is to bring the doctors over here and shoot it as 2 layers. As the doctors talk about whether or not to pull the plug, notice again how the eyes read the frame. This is extremely effective, and with just 2 layers, the shot is more than twice as compelling. Even more so as the man suddenly lifts his head. He sits up, and our attention is torn between the layers, until the doctors finally see him moving and turn in amazement, after which most of the attention is on the back layer. In the meanwhile, we've completely forgotten to edit. The more we separate layers with distance, the more distinct the layers become. Here the characters are lumped together on the same plane, and at some level we perceive them as one character or one unit. With the woman out here, we don't necessarily feel that the characters are more distant from each other than before. But we feel their emotions much more individually, which creates more tension or juxtaposition within the frame than if we'd done 2 separate shots, and is far more interesting. However, the thing about deep staging is that even if we don't have several obvious stories to combine, simply staging like this actually creates them just by the fact that we're including multiple things in one shot. Most scenes can first of all be modified to deep staging type shots simply by how we frame cameras. A useful habit is to always look for ways to include characters in each other's shots at varying depths. As soon as we get the red man in the background of the blue man's shot, the shot has 2 layers. Unless the red man is completely frozen, we're automatically getting 2 stories just by the fact that he's standing there and reacting to the scene. Again over here, the red woman is talking to the blue man, but let's frame the shot to include the blue woman in the background, and also position the extra to conveniently fill the gap in the frame. As we cut the dialogue, each shot is far more dynamic and complex. This, of course, works the same with getting other characters into the foreground, as in this shot, which is primarily the woman's shot, but includes the other character in an open framing. Another way is to place other characters in gaps in the frame, the same as we've done with extras. Here the main dialogue is between these 2 characters, with the blue woman occasionally participating. So to pick a mark for her, we'll place her in the gap in the frame. This is also what we did with the doctors, except the shot was a right-angle master, but the placement of characters in the empty space was the same. On a larger scale, a useful way to look at this way of staging is as painting the frame with characters. Here the central characters are seated around a table, and we need to find a way to position all the supporting characters and extras which are currently standing haphazardly. So to again stage by filling gaps in the frame, we'll move the blue man over here, the blue woman over here, these 2 extras over here, and this extra over here. Likewise in this shot, we started with the central characters in the front and positioned the blue characters at varying depths to fit with the gaps in the frame. A third deep staging technique, which is perhaps the most 3-dimensionally vivid, is staggered staging. It's based on the centuries-old idea that an S-shaped curve weaving into the depth of the image creates a very pleasing composition that comfortably guides the eye. How this translates to staging is that we get the same effect by arranging characters in a staggered or zigzag fashion. Just as in the picture from before, the S-curve guides the eye into the frame and also does a great job at creating depth. This scene is mostly theoretical and may be a little on the nose. But used like this, the staggered placement of characters creates a very deep and elegant composition. The fourth technique for setting up deep staging comes from the idea that the space closest to the camera is the most private or confidential. Placing a character here allows us to identify much more with her than the others, and it can be useful to set up shots for that specific purpose. Anytime a character is within this area, we get a personal and private view. If we're with a team of bank robbers preparing a heist, and we know that someone may be an informant, having the red man walk over here where only we can see his face is very telling. Even if it's just for a moment. So of course this type of deep staging is a natural part of intimacy, honesty, and power because we get to see what nobody is really supposed to see. But regardless of how we compose deep staging shots, the question is how to integrate them into the blocking. Usually a scene will have only a couple, and because they're the most complicated, they need to go in first. Returning to the scene with the doctors, we'll assume that there's more action than just this shot, but we'll plan that one first and build the scene around it. Before that, we'll have the blue man prepare some instruments on a small table, so we'll set up a single shot for that. Let's have the woman start over here, facing away, and set up a second deep staging shot with him in the far background. While they're in these positions, the first deep staging shot only contains the patient. We'll have the man be the first to step into that shot, and cut some dialogue between these two cameras. As the woman also steps into that shot, this is now our only camera. As the patient suddenly wakes up, we'll have them walk over to the bed, and a little later have the woman walk over to the desk to call someone on the intercom, for which we'll put in a phantom character in order to frame a staggered deep staging shot like this. Before she walks to the last mark, this shot is a two-shot on the men, so we'll put in another camera to mirror, pivoting on the patient. This really shows how easily deep staging creates sophisticated blocking. Starting on the man in a coma, we cut to the blue man as he prepares to pull the plug. The woman is facing away, so she's presumably having second thoughts. The blue man walks over and stops in a half-complete right-angle master. After some dialogue here, the woman walks over, completing the original deep staging shot. As they talk, the patient suddenly comes out of his coma, creating two stories in one frame. They see him moving and rush over. And we cut to this shot as the blue man steps in. Pivoting on the patient, the woman walks over to the intercom, turning the previous shot into a staggered deep staging shot, which seems like a lucky coincidence. When she's done, she walks closer, still filling the gap in the frame. So that's an enormous amount of mileage from just 5 cameras. Another very clever aspect of deep staging is placing characters or objects in the background or foreground before they're needed. We've already been doing this a couple of times, and what it does is again create the perception of a lucky coincidence. Here we're having dialogue between the red characters, and the woman in the background doesn't seem to be a part of the scene, but just an extra. Back in the first reverse, the blue woman suddenly turns and joins the dialogue. The fact that the framing already included her seems serendipitous because we didn't expect her to be important. Doing the same with foreground, here 2 detectives are scanning a crime scene looking for evidence and trying to find something they can dust for fingerprints. Suddenly the woman discovers the soda cans, then the man, and they both walk over. Already having the soda cans in the foreground creates the feeling of a scene that knows where it's going and enhances our sense of being told a story. In this chapter, we'll look at a compelling aspect of deep staging, which is creating attention shifts between layers. When objects or characters move in and out of shots, our attention suddenly moves to that new level of depth, creating a vivid 3-dimensional experience. These shifts grab our attention, they create a great sense of production value, and can be a real showcase of directing ability. For these types of shots, racking focus adds enormously to the experience, as here where we rack focus out on the character that steps in, and it's sometimes the primary reason for setting up shots like this. But a key distinction is again that if we put our entire effort into simply creating deep shots, the shifting effects will be an automatic byproduct, and we'll actually get many more of them. Shifting depth is far easier to create than it looks. If we consider each layer a plane that exists before we slide it into the frame, the surprise is really just to the audience and not to us. One way to do this is to have characters step into the foreground or background of each other's shots. Here we've set up a deep stop as reference, but we're starting with a man outside the frame. So to begin with, the shot belongs to the woman. When the man steps in, we get the attention shift. When we add focus racking, which we'll do in a couple of chapters, this can be very effective. We could even have the man exit the frame as he continues talking off camera, shifting back to the woman's depth, until he steps back in again. Here we've set up a deep stop as reference, but the man will start out sitting down. So we're starting in a wide shot with them both. We go to a closer shot on the woman for a line, which is a deep stop. When the man stands up, we get a very nice shift. Here we're in a scene in a hospital, and the blue man is tending to the patient. At some point, the woman steps into the foreground. This current staging was the reference we built it from, but only we knew that. It's the same when characters step into the background of each other's shots. Here we're in an over-the-shoulder between the red characters, and will ultimately have the blue woman step in between them to fill the gap in the frame. For her first mark, we'll add a single shot. But starting in the over-the-shoulder, the shot is just the two red characters. We cut to the blue woman's single shot. She walks out, and we cut back to the over-the-shoulder, where she steps in, creating a shift. Another technique is to create deep inserts. Here the man is holding a pendulum, and to get an insert of that, we might as well get the woman in the background. So starting in that insert, we'll assume that the background is out of focus. As the man lifts the pendulum up, sliding that plane out, our attention goes to the woman. If this is instead where we start, our attention goes to the pendulum as he lowers it into the frame. One more technique is to create deep reveals. Here we assume the man is the only person in the shot, but when he walks out, our attention goes to the woman in the background. This works even if the background is just the set. As the man walks out, our attention still goes deeper into the frame as he clears it. All these shifts are effective, and it can make sense to set up shots for that reason alone. But we can actually create them as an automatic byproduct of deep staging by setting up as many deep stops as possible and then simply let the characters move between them. Here we'll create the first deep stop with the man in front of the woman. For the next deep stop, the man has walked over here, and we'll create a shot with the blue man in the foreground. Over on the woman, we'll create a stop after she stood up, framed with the extra in the background. She walks over to the red man, and we'll frame a right-angle master, prepared as a deep stop for when the blue man steps into the middle of it. With each of the stops set up to be deep, it's really just the editing that decides whether we get to see the shift. Starting on the shot on the woman, the red man steps in. He walks out. We cut to the shot on the blue man, and the red man steps into the background. For the stop where the woman stands up, we'll start it blank with the extra in the background, and let the woman stand up into the shot. She walks out, and into the shot by the red man, which is not deep in itself, until the blue man steps in, causing another shift. As we're now getting ready to make focus decisions for the shots we've created in the previous chapters, let's first take an in-depth look at how focus works. It's difficult to keep a scene in focus at all depths. Instead, there's an area at a certain distance from the camera where objects are sharp, which is known as the depth of field. Objects closer to us or further away become increasingly blurry. Depth of field is not just a choice we have to make, it's a choice we'll want to make, because selectively focusing on one object in the scene makes that object stand out and is a very effective storytelling tool. This makes depth of field a directing choice, and in order to make the best decisions, it's useful to know exactly how light ends up on film. The simplest camera is what's called a pinhole camera, and goes back hundreds of years. Here there are no lenses or anything else camera-like, but simply a box with a piece of film inside and a tiny hole. When the hole is uncovered by moving the shutter out of the way, it's the only passage of light onto the film. So any light from the top of the vase ends up at the bottom of the film, and any light from the bottom of the vase ends up at the top, forming an upside-down image. With a pinhole camera, depth of field is nearly infinite because the hole is very small. Any light ray coming from further away or closer to the camera still has only one way to get onto the film, so the image is sharp at all depths. The problem is that most light rays in the scene aren't lucky enough to make it through the hole. So we have to expose for a long time, anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. This isn't fast enough for recording film at 24 frames per second, but it would also produce unacceptable motion blur because while the shutter is open, any movement creates a smear. To get more light onto the film, we need to open up the hole or aperture. But a larger aperture also gives light more than one way to get onto the film. So light coming from this point on the vase now hits the film in this whole area, producing blurriness. If we want a more open aperture, we need a lens to focus the light. As we look at this lens diagram, it's best to forget the diagram from the focal length chapter. Lenses aren't really constructed this way, so any diagram is an analogy, and even though they look similar, we're examining different functions. Light from any point in the scene radiates in all directions, but since we're only interested in the light that hits the lens, we can see it as a cone. This means that all light coming from a point on the vase hits all over the lens from top to bottom. Lenses have the ability to bend light, so as the rays pass through the lens, the cone shrinks again. Now floating in space somewhere behind the lens is a place where the rays reassemble, forming a single sharp point. If we don't stop the light, it continues, forming a new cone. This point of sharpness is where we'll place the film plane. Any point on the surface of the vase now contributes to a sharp upside-down image on the film, so the vase is in focus. But for light coming from in front of the vase, the cone shape is offset, and the light rays don't converge exactly on the film plane, but somewhere behind. When the cone intersects the film plane, the light rays are scattered instead of focused. This is called the circle of confusion because there's no telling where the light rays will land except that it will be somewhere within this circle. Looking at light from the blue dot behind the vase, the point of focus is somewhere in front of the film, and the rays again end up scattered on the film plane. When we're focusing, we're effectively making small adjustments to the shape of the lens to make the light rays hit the film at the right point. Here we're now focused on the blue dot. But if we look at the light from the red dot, it's more out of focus than before. So the image is sharpest at the point of focus and then becomes increasingly blurry in either direction. If we bring focus back to the vase, the depth of field is the area around the focus point that's perceived to be in focus. In reality, the image is only in focus exactly at the focus point, but for the surrounding area, the circle of confusion is still small enough that we perceive it as sharp. However, because the lens is wide open, the depth of field is in this case so shallow that if we were shooting a character and he leaned 5 inches forwards, he would go out of focus. We expand the depth of field range by closing the aperture. Apertures are measured in f-stops, with an f1 being a wide open lens and an f32 being an almost closed lens. All cameras and all biological eyes have an aperture whose primary function is to control the amount of light that hits the film or optical nerves. If we walk from sunlight into a room, the room appears dark until the eye opens up the aperture or iris to let more light in. But as we close the aperture, we also shrink the cone and thereby the circle of confusion, which gives us a wider range of acceptable focus and therefore more depth of field. Here the vase is still in focus, and if we sample the red dot, the circle of confusion is much smaller than before. With a very small aperture, we're back to a pinhole camera. But since we're now getting less light, we either have to use a more sensitive film or a slower shutter. So the drawback to asking for much of the scene to be in focus is that we risk needing too much light or getting too much motion blur, and so depth of field can be a problem in very dark scenes. But sometimes we're deliberately trying to make the depth of field more shallow in order to single out a character and blur out the background and foreground. Here we again want to single out the vase, but if we're shooting in a bright place like outdoors, we need to limit the light or we'd overexpose the film. If we limit the light with the aperture, we'll make the entire scene sharper. If we speed up the shutter, we'll also get less light on the film, but instead get potential strobing because of the lack of motion blur, which we usually need a little bit of. We can also put what's called neutral density filters, or NDs, in front of the lens, which filters out some of the light without changing its color. We can now open the aperture a little more. By adding another ND, we can open the aperture a little more. Sometimes a whole stack is needed to get the aperture wide open in bright light. On 35mm film, it's fairly easy to get a shallow depth of field, and we're often shooting with the lens half closed, or the effect is simply too much. But if we're shooting a smaller format, for example digital video, the film plane is instead an electronic chip often only 2/3 of an inch or smaller. This means that everything else, including lens and aperture, is also smaller, and we're much closer to being a pinhole camera. Digital video is notorious for having too much depth of field. In order to get any kind of depth blur at all, we often need to shoot with the lens consistently wide open and control the exposure using only the shutter and by slapping NDs in front. Another way to get more shallow depth of field is to use a longer focal length. As with perspective, longer focal lengths don't actually change the image, they simply magnify part of it. So if we zoom in on part of an image, we get the appearance of more depth blur, but the depth of field is really the same. So for shooting digital, it helps to set up further back and zoom in more. That and shooting with the lens wide open are the simplest ways to make that medium look like film. Depth of field is such an abstract thing that it can sometimes be hard to communicate. It doesn't make sense for us to start talking in f-stops and shutter speeds, but we need to understand the variables involved. One way to communicate depth of field is to have a small collection of prints with varying degrees of focus that we can show to the cinematographer for reference. Another way is to physically show the range on the set that we want in acceptable focus, for instance from here to here. But perhaps the best way is to show on the field monitor the size of the blur we want. Here we'll say that we want the background blur this tall, in which case the cinematographer will balance all the variables. If we're shooting film, all we can do next is cross our fingers, but if we're shooting digital, we can see the final result on the monitor and make judgments right away, which is a big plus of that medium. Finally, let's talk about the shape of the blur itself. Often the aperture is not a circle, but instead a polygon created by a number of blades that rotate inwards to close the aperture. That means that in this case, the circle of confusion is really an octagon of confusion. This is not so visible on an even background like this shot of a sofa, but it's very visible on a background with distinct highlights. Here the blur takes on the shape of the aperture itself, so if we know we want a shot like this, which can be extremely decorative, it might make sense to request an aperture with a certain shape ahead of time. When we're blurring out bright lights, we additionally introduce a phenomenon called bloom, where the out-of-focus lights come out brighter than if they were in focus. The reason is that when we're in focus, the bright lights are actually overexposing the film. If the film can record any shade from, let's say, 0 to 50 light units, anything brighter will simply show as maximum brightness no matter how bright it is. But when we're out of focus, that extra brightness the film couldn't handle in a single point now gets spread over a much larger area of the film, so we get to see the truer brightness of the lights. Blurred out point lights create a subtle magic when they're out of focus, and intentionally placing highlights in an out of focus background is a great trick to remember. Choosing where to place focus is really very easy and can be done as one of the last decisions before shooting, which is why we've held it until now. Since we're in a 3D environment, the type of focus we'll use in this chapter is a rough computer simulation and not a real optical focus, but for making focus decisions it'll do fine. For static shots, we naturally want to keep the character who's the subject of the shot in focus. This is very straightforward when there's only one. With several characters as in this shot, a wide depth of field would keep both women in focus as long as we're focusing in the general area. So if we don't want the actors to worry about hitting marks precisely, a wide depth of field is more forgiving. But with a more narrow depth of field, we might not be able to keep them both completely sharp, as here where the blue woman is about to go out of focus. A common solution is to split the difference and place the focus plane somewhere between them. With more distance between the characters, we need to be more selective. In this two-shot, the characters are far enough apart and the depth of field narrow enough that we can only focus on one of them. Where we place focus essentially decides whose shot it is. So as the blue man talks, we'll rack focus to him. As the red man talks, we'll rack focus back to him. But the question is how much to rack focus back and forth. In this shot, we could conceivably rack focus on every line, which would bring a lot of attention to itself. Instead, two things are useful to know, one of which is that it works perfectly fine to have one character stay out of focus during most of the dialogue. Whoever we choose is then the character we're most identified with, even if it's not the closest character. The other thing is that we can then use focus to bring sudden emphasis to the other character. If we've been identified with a man throughout the dialogue, suddenly racking focus to the woman brings sudden emphasis and meaning to what's happening for her. Racking focus to add meaning is a useful way to look at it. With this shot on the man, the clock is an arbitrary foreground object, until we rack focus, showing that it has meaning. Racking focus combined with a character turning is an effective way to help throw the attention in and out of the scene. Here the woman turns to the man, which in itself is a shift, but the rack focus adds to it. As she turns away, we rack focus back out here, which again emphasizes the turn. In choosing how fast to rack focus, anything over a second is usually too slow. If we rack focus slowly, there will be a long period where both characters are out of focus, and since the move is too subtle to be detected, it can instead come across as a mistake. So it's usually an effect we want to bring attention to. But doing it very fast is maybe too much of a surprise. For most situations, a little less than a second is normally the best speed. For moving characters, we simply need to follow focus. Here we've measured 2 focus distances, and as the character walks, we try to match the speed so she'll stay sharp. It's usually pretty obvious how and when to rack focus, so let's go through some shots from the previous chapters in no particular order and make focus decisions. Starting in a static shot, here we'll just put focus on the central characters and let the extras in front and behind blur out a little. In the scene with the quicksand, we'll keep focus on the characters walking. The sign is still readable, but we'll rack focus to it to add meaning. In the scene with the bank robbers preparing a heist, we'll start with focus on the characters whose faces we can see. As the man walks over to be private, we'll follow focus on him. The other characters turn and we rack focus to them. Then back to the man for reaction, then back on the other characters again. This shot is the one where the blue woman steps into the foreground. For the entire shot, we'll keep focus on the blue man and the patient because there would be no sense in placing focus on the back of her head. In the longer scene in the hospital, in this shot we'll just put a permanent focus on the blue man. In this shot, we'll lay focus on the woman. As the man walks and talks in the background, we'll leave him out of focus. In this shot where he steps in, we'll put permanent focus on the foreground plane. Back on the woman, she walks over, and we follow focus or she would quickly get blurry. Back in this shot, which now becomes a right-angle master with the patient in the background, we'll keep the focus in the foreground. But as the patient moves, rack focus to him. We rack focus back to the doctors as they discover him moving. Then follow focus as they walk over to the patient. In this shot, we need both the doctor and the patient in focus, so we'll use a wider depth of field and split the difference. In this shot, we'll put focus on the woman, but as she walks out, rack focus to the patient. Back in this shot, the woman steps into the background, but we're keeping focus in the foreground. Until she turns. And we follow focus as she walks forwards, ending up splitting the difference. The amount of focus racking we did in this scene is maybe overkill, but it almost automatically enhances shots that were simply staged for depth. In this scene, the blue woman steps into the background before she's needed, but we keep her out of focus, which adds to the assumption that she's an extra. As she turns to talk, we rack focus to her. Here we're with the detectives looking for clues. Initially, we'll place focus on them, but we can still make out the soda cans in the foreground. When the red woman discovers the sodas, we rack focus to them. As she talks to the red man, we rack focus to him. Then follow focus with him as he steps closer. This is the scene where the man steps in and out, so we'll simply rack focus to him when he's in the foreground. And back on the woman when he steps out. When he steps back in, we rack focus out on him again. These effects are simply a byproduct of deep stops, and as long as we stage for depth, they'll come by automatically. Here we're focused on the woman. As the man stands up into the shot, we rack focus to him. With added focus, deep inserts almost create 2 separate shots in one. Here we're focused on the pendulum. As it lifts out, we rack focus to the woman. By the same token, if this is where we start, the man will lower the pendulum and we rack focus, creating an almost separate shot. In this deep reveal, we're starting on the man, but as he walks out, we naturally rack focus to the woman in the background. So racking focus is so easy to both do and stage for that it's almost a non-issue. Finally, revisiting the scene based on deep stops, we're starting with focus on the woman, then rack focus to the man as he steps in, and back on the woman as he steps out. Over here on the blue man, we'll keep focus on him as the red man steps in. For the shot where the woman stands up, the extra in the background isn't important enough for a focus shift, so we'll keep focus on the foreground plane. In this shot, we're keeping focus on the man's plane, also as the woman steps in. And as the blue man steps in, the man's plane is still the most interesting one. As a last topic on stationary blocking, let's look at using mirrors, hotspots, and shadows. Mirrors add a level of sophistication to the blocking, but it's very normal to forget to use them because they're a more indirect way of capturing a subject. Using mirrors is very straightforward, so the purpose of this chapter is not so much to learn new techniques, but to remember to use them. The most basic way to shoot a character with mirrors is to have her face away and capture her through the mirror. We're framing the shot for her reflection instead of for her, and one way to look at it is as an over-the-shoulder where both characters are the same one. A couple of things to notice about shooting through mirrors are first of all that it's much easier to work with the angle of the mirror to get the right framing than it is to change the camera position. Even the slightest adjustment to the mirror drastically changes the angle, so to get her higher in the frame, all we have to do is tip the mirror a bit forwards. Another thing is that using a longer focal length to compress the space and even out character sizes only has half the effect because the light has to travel twice the distance. So to even out the relationship in size between her and her reflection, we'll need to get further back and use a longer focal length than we normally would. And then maybe tweak the mirror again to perfect the framing. The main thing to look out for when placing cameras is to never shoot directly into a mirror for obvious reasons. We always need to shoot at an angle, so let's move over here. And again adjust the mirror slightly. But in this case, that's still not enough. A neat trick for getting the camera out of the way is pulling back, which quickly makes the camera disappear, and then zooming in to get the shot size back with the added benefit of compressing the space. Another thing to look out for is that having a mirror in the scene is effectively the same as having one more camera shooting in the other direction. Sets are usually not built 360 degrees unless it's absolutely necessary, so it's very possible to suddenly shoot off the set. This can either be fixed with better placement of mirrors, or by bringing in small sections of set just to cover the reflected area. And the same goes for mirrors facing upwards, revealing the ceiling and light fixtures, which is slightly harder to cover because the extra set pieces need to be suspended, but also block the lights. Mirrors become really interesting when the dialogue is happening through the mirror. This shot is basically set up as a deep staging shot, except through a mirror. This can be especially elegant if after dialogue like this, the woman turns. We frame for her and continue cutting between two internal reverses. Another way to bring in a character using a mirror is to have the mirror be a stand-in for him. Here we're getting a direct angle on the woman and an indirect angle on the man. Like deep staging, shots through mirrors take slightly longer to read and therefore stay interesting for longer. A different way to use reflections is with windows. The interesting thing about windows is that they can be reflective and transparent at the same time, so we can capture both the main character and some business happening in the reflection. Here we've put the woman behind a window, some other characters out in the yard, and of course angled the camera. This creates a very engaging composition with two distinct layers of meaning. In order to make this work properly, we need to use polarizers, which are camera filters that can turn the level of reflections up and down without changing much else. By adjusting the filter, we can almost remove a reflection, or bring it to maximum level, which gives a lot of freedom to create a composite in camera. Somewhere in between is usually about right. Besides that, using reflection simply creates richer framings with more to look at. Here the reflection in the table is part of the framing. Here we've made a top-heavy framing to include the reflections in the floor. Here the woman's reflection in the dark glass wall is again part of the framing, giving us more to look at. There are a number of other ways to use reflections which belong in different chapters, so let's hold here for now. Moving on to hotspots and shadows, what we'll do here is coordinate lighting and character movement so that characters stop in places that are purposefully bright or dark. People don't coordinate their movement like this in real life, but visually it's a powerful way to show characters' emotions. Standing in a hotspot shows a willingness or desire to be seen, which a character can use to bring emphasis or importance to himself. But it also means that he's more exposed, so standing in a hotspot either means that the character is courageous enough to be seen, or that he's put submissively on the spot while other characters stand in the safety of darkness. Standing in a shadow shows an unwillingness to be seen, and usually involves some form of shame or hiding. So as the man talks about a painful childhood memory, let's have him step out of the hotspot and into a shadow, which very effectively shows him shying away. As the woman forgets about her own reason for hiding and steps forward to comfort him, let's have her stop in the hotspot, making her the more open and revealed one. Hotspots and shadows work on the same principles as intimacy, honesty, and power, and they can be just as easy to detect in a script, so let's look at how to build them into the blocking. Some hotspots and shadows are caused by the set design, but since the set and lighting are often completely flexible, it makes sense to actually ask for specific lighting to be built into the production design if we know we can use it. Then we simply plan the stops around the lighting as we did here. But we can just as easily create artificial hotspots or shadows. Unless a lighting tweak is completely unmotivated and illogical for the scene, we usually have a lot of freedom, because who knows which light sources or obstructions are outside the frame. So as the man has walked over here, let's decide to make this a shadow and bring in something to block the main light. Starting back at the table, the man walks away and steps into a shade that's completely plausible. The only time it's not plausible is when we've both seen and remembered a wide master and know for a fact that there's no shadow there. Here we've created the shadow by bringing in a flag, which creates a hard edge, but we could just as well have brought down the light in that area of the set, creating a softer shadow. By the same token, we can usually create hotspots where we want them, because there's no telling which light sources could be outside the frame. Here the set is fairly dim, and repeating the move from before, there's no change. So let's bring up a light for his second stop. And let's also create a couple of arbitrary hotspots deeper into the scene so it doesn't stand on its own, although it's not crucial. Starting again from the first stop, the scene is dark except for a couple of streaks. The man walks over and steps into a completely credible hotspot. So it's fairly straightforward to make up hotspots and shadows on the fly as well.